Minex Forum presents a podcast, Central Asia's Critical Minerals Moment. What the reports don't tell you.
If you want to build an F-35 fighter jet or, an advanced MRI machine or even just $1 million offshore wind turbine today.
You need a lot of highly specific material.
Right. And your supply chain doesn't actually start in some high-tech manufacturing plant in Ohio or Germany. It starts in the dirt of this massive landlocked expanse in Central Asia.
And then almost immediately it hits a brick wall.
Exactly. An impenetrable geopolitical brick wall in China. Because, well, for years, Central Asia was practically a footnote in Western policy, right? We just viewed it through the lens of oil and gas.
Yeah, that was the old paradigm.
But today, for you and me navigating the reality of 2026, it is the absolute center of the board. The global scramble for critical minerals has just, it's turned the region into a flashing red priority. So welcome to a brand new deep dive into exactly why that is and what the landscape is actually going to look like by the end of the decade.
The shift in focus really is staggering. I mean, we are no longer just talking about fueling the industrial economy. We're talking about securing the fundamental atomic building blocks of 21st century technology,
Right.
and doing so under extreme geopolitical duress.
And our mission today is to cut right through the diplomatic hype. We really want to figure out what's actually happening on the ground. So we're looking at a stack of comprehensive, freshly minted 2026 reports.
Some really vital data in these.
Oh, absolutely. We're anchoring this with Arthur Polikoff's Minex Forum analysis, alongside the Caspian Policy Center's report, which is aptly titled Finding Rocks in Hard Places. Love that title.
Fitting, yeah.
We're also integrating a really detailed paper from the EU Institute for Security Studies, the EUISS, and a pivotal strategy document from the Council on Foreign Relations.
And, synthesizing these specific sources is crucial right now, because if you just read the press releases coming out of all these recent summits, you'd think the West has the supply chain completely secured.
Right, like it's all handled.
Exactly. But the data tells a much more complicated and honestly a far more treacherous story.
Well, I'll say this right out of the gate. Reading through the geological data alone, it is really hard not to be incredibly optimistic. I mean, the sheer scale of the mineral potential in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, it's just massive.
It's a gold mine, figuratively and literally in some cases.
Yeah. And they aren't just sitting on these rocks either. Like, let's look at Kazakhstan. They're aggressively reforming their entire bureaucratic system to get this stuff out of the ground. They've totally overhauled their subsoil code.
Right, moving away from that old system.
Yeah, moving from this tangled licensing nightmare to a streamlined, first come, first served model for exploration. And more importantly, they've adopted the CRISCO International Reporting Standards.
Which is a massive signal to the market.
Exactly. For those who don't, spend their days reading mining prospectuses, adopting CRISCO means their subsurface geological estimates are now legally bankable data.
Right, you can take it to the bank.
Literally. You can take those numbers to a bank in London or New York and get a loan against them for Western institutional investors. And because of that, their geological exploration investment has tripled since 2018. It's well over $1 billion now.
The capital is definitely flowing into exploration.
You've got heavyweights like Rio Tinto, Barrick Gold, First Quantum. They're all entering the fray. So step one, just finding the rocks and getting them out of the ground, is seeing a literal rare earth rush.
Right. The momentum in extraction is undeniable. But what's fascinating here is that this is where the optimism usually obscures a massive structural bottleneck.
The processing.
Exactly. Getting the rock out of the ground is only the beginning of a very painful process. We have to look at what happens next. And that is where China's dominance is absolute.
Give us the numbers.
Well, China currently controls approximately 90% of global rare earth refining. They control 60% of lithium processing, over 70% of cobalt refining.
Wow.
And by 2022, they effectively consolidated 100% of global graphite processing.
Okay, let's unpack this. So even if a Western mining consortium successfully pulls raw ore out of a pit in Kazakhstan, they're basically forced to put it on a train to China to make it usable.
Yes.
So it's basically like we found a massive sprawling wheat field and we're projecting all the bread we're going to sell, but China owns 90% of the flour mills.
Well, I'm going to stop you right there because that analogy is actually part of the problem.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, milling wheat is a simple physical process, right? You crush it, you get flour. Rare earth refining is nothing like that. It's more like being handed a fully baked cake and being told to chemically extract just the eggs and the sugar,
No.
all while dealing with highly toxic radioactive byproducts.
Okay, that paints a much more intense picture.
Yeah.
Break down why it's actually that difficult.
So rare earth elements are chemically nearly identical to one another, and they're bound together in the rock, often alongside radioactive materials like thorium.
That sounds like a nightmare to separate.
It is. Separating them requires hundreds of consecutive solvent extraction steps using highly corrosive acids. The environmental devastation, the toxicity involved, it's just immense.
And the West just didn't want to deal with that.
Exactly. For decades, the West effectively outsourced this dirty work to China because of strict domestic environmental regulations. As a result, China didn't just build factories. They spent 30 years developing hyper-specific metallurgical IP and, frankly, the tolerance for the environmental fallout.
Right.
You cannot just replicate that overnight by throwing money at it.
And because they hold the keys to that chemical separation process, they can completely dictate the terms. The EUISS paper documents exactly how Beijing is weaponizing this bottleneck.
Yes, the export controls.
Right. In 2025, they sharply reduced exports of raw materials like germanium and gallium. And to be clear to you listening, this isn't just some squabble over obscure chemistry. Gallium and germanium are the exact elements required to manufacture advanced ESA military radar systems.
And high-end semiconductor logic chips. The EUSS report classifies that move not as a trade dispute, but as a systematic geo-economic weapon. Beijing used export licensing to essentially map out and extract information about Western defense industrial networks.
Which is terrifying.
It is. They used it to coerce EU trade policy regarding electric vehicles and to quietly deter Japan from strengthening its defense posture around Taiwan. The leverage they have is immense.
And there's a ticking clock attached to this leverage right now, isn't there?
Yeah.
Like, there was a détente reached at the Xi-Trump-Busan summit in late 2025, where China temporarily suspended some of those rare earth export controls.
Yeah, a temporary suspension.
But that was only for 1 year. It is scheduled to reactivate in November 2026. The structural disease remains completely untreated. Bulyakov sums this up with a very sobering line. He says, owning a deposit in Central Asia without access to non-Chinese processing is like owning an oil field with no pipeline.
Which brings us to the Western response. Because the natural assumption is that Washington and Brussels are moving aggressively to build those metaphorical pipelines.
And they certainly are on paper. I mean, look at the flurry of recent action. Just a few weeks ago, on June 10th, we saw the C5+1 Critical Minerals Dialogue hosted in Astana.
Right.
The U.S. is rolling out Project Vault, which is touted as a $12 billion public-private reserve initiative. And President Tokayev of Kazakhstan recently secured $17 billion in new bilateral agreements with the U.S. But hold on, if we are throwing $17 billion at this, how is that just political theater? That's real capital.
The headline numbers look fantastic, I agree. But what's fascinating here is a crucial concept Polyakov introduces called MO-inflation, Memoranda of Understanding Inflation.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means the political declarations are drastically outpacing the actual physical deployment of capital. Those agreements establish political will, sure, but they frequently lack binding financial commitments.
So no one is actually writing the check.
Exactly. And the reason for that hesitation comes down to a fundamental misalignment in how capital works in the West versus China.
You're talking about the timeline mismatch.
Precisely. Developing a major mining and refining project from the initial geological survey through the environmental permitting to pouring concrete and finally producing refined material, it takes 20 years or more.
That is a massive lead time.
Now consider the hurdle rates of Western private equity. Institutional investors generally want to see a return on investment in 5 to 7 years. They do not want to lock up billions of dollars in a politically complex region for 2 decades.
Especially when the market is so volatile.
Right, especially when China could easily flood the market and crash prices the moment that Western mine opens, just totally wiping out their investment.
Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative is playing an entirely different game.
Completely different. They are operating with state-subsidized capital. They don't have quarterly earnings calls. They don't have 4 to 5 year election cycles.
Right.
They are perfectly comfortable financing infrastructure and mining operations on 20 or 30-year horizons because the strategic goal is supply chain dominance, not immediate financial yield.
But what about the U.S. Forge Initiative? That was highly publicized as, like, the mechanism to counter the Belt and Road in this exact sector.
4G is the perfect example of MOU inflation. When you actually dissect the structure of Forge, unlike its predecessor, it is not a pooled multilateral investment fund.
Wait, really?
No, it is essentially a membership by trade model.
So it's a framework, not a giant pot of deployed money.
Exactly. It's a shared pricing architecture designed to set market rules and theoretically de-risk bilateral deals. But the actual burden of writing the checks and absorbing that massive capital risk, that still falls on individual corporations.
And the private sector is obviously going to balk at that.
They see the risk clearly. Despite all the EU summits and critical minerals acts, as of late 2025, only 5 EU companies have actually deployed capital into critical raw material projects in Central Asia.
5.
5 companies, for an entire continent's supply chain security.
That is a staggering disconnect between policy goals and market reality. Okay, so let's actually play out a best-case scenario. Say a Western consortium absorbs the risk, digs up the ore, and somehow builds the incredibly complex, toxic processing facilities to close that midstream gap.
A big if, but okay.
Right. We still have to physically move the finished materials out of a landlocked region sandwiched directly between Russia and China. How do we even get it to European manufacturing hubs?
This is the logistics puzzle, and it is arguably the most fragile link in the entire chain.
The reports highlight the middle corridor as the solution here. For those listening, this is the overland Trans-Caspian route. You put goods on a train in Kazakhstan, ferry them across the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, and then take them by rail through Georgia to the Black Sea.
Bypassing the sanctioned Russian routes to the north and Iran to the south.
Exactly. And the volume is surging. Freight has increased 5-fold in 7 years, hitting 4.1 million tons in 2024. With the current blockade in the Strait of Hormuz pushing global oil above $110 a barrel, an independent overland route isn't just a nice idea, it feels like an absolute necessity.
It is an indispensable artery. But the entire Trans-Caspian network has a single hyper-concentrated vulnerability that gets very little mainstream coverage.
The Republic of Georgia.
Yes. Until highly complex alternative routes through Armenia or Azerbaijan are fully modernized and operational, Georgia is the middle corridor's only gateway to the Black Sea and subsequently to Europe.
Because it's the bottleneck. Everything funnels through there.
Everything. The World Bank identified the Anaklia deep-sea port in Georgia as the absolute critical infrastructure priority to handle this increased capacity. The Black Sea coast has physical constraints, and Anaklia is really the only viable location for deep-water shipping.
And the Georgian government just slashed the funding for it.
Drastically. They cut the port's funding from 150 million lari down to just 50 million.
Wow.
And their existing port infrastructure at Batumi and Poti is already operating near maximum exhaustion.
Wait, if the World Bank says it's a critical priority, why isn't international development money just stepping in to cover the gap? I mean, we are pouring billions into modernizing this massive multi-lane Eurasian logistics highway. And right at the exit ramp to Europe, we're letting it merge into a single underfunded dirt road.
That is where the geopolitical maneuvering comes into play. The reports detail some very concerning context regarding the port's development.
Okay, like what?
Well, back in 2020, a Western-led consortium was essentially pushed out of the Anaklia port contract. And recently, the Georgian government selected a new preferred contractor to build it. That contractor is a Chinese-Singaporean firm that is currently under U.S. sanctions.
You have to be kidding. So Beijing is essentially building the very port that the West needs to bypass Beijing.
Exactly. The analysis points to a highly credible suspicion that China is quietly applying pressure on Tbilisi to slow walk and choke the Western route's capacity. Think about this strategic geometry here. China benefits enormously from the northern corridor that runs through Russia. It handles their European rail freight efficiently. They have zero strategic interest in seeing the middle corridor successfully mature into an independent supply line that gives the West unrestricted access to Central Asian minerals.
That is so smart. Because by controlling the choke point in Georgia, they don't even have to embargo the minerals. They just make sure the infrastructure can never scale up enough to threaten their monopoly. That is incredibly calculated.
Which thrusts Turkey into a highly significant role. As Georgia continues to act as a logistical bottleneck, Turkey is aggressively positioning itself as the indispensable guardian of that corridor.
Taking advantage of the situation.
Yes, they have the geographic position connecting to Europe, they harbor their own ambitions for deep processing facilities, and they are actively co-investing with Central Asian nations through the Organization of Turkic States. Turkey is playing to be the ultimate geopolitical swing state in this entire equation.
So, synthesizing all of this, the mining boom in Kazakhstan, the nightmare of rare earth separation chemistry that China dominates, the illusion of MOU inflation, and this incredibly fragile, politically compromised port in Georgia, well, it's the actual 2030 forecast. Sitting here in 2026, where do the analysts say we are realistically going to be in 4 years?
Poliakov's assessment provides a very grounded reality check. It isn't a scenario of total Western failure, but it certainly isn't the utopian independence that Washington desires.
Okay, so a mixed bag.
Right. By 2030, Kazakhstan will have achieved significant integration into Western markets, particularly in uranium, which is structurally different from rare earths. Uzbekistan will be a major, reliable player in gold and copper, and Turkey will likely have cemented its role as a credible logistics and mid-tier processing ally.
But the midstream gap, the rare earth refining monopoly, that remains.
It remains. The West will have chipped away at the edges, narrowing the gap slightly, but it will not be closed. You cannot unwind 30 years of specialized metallurgical IP, environmental tolerance, and state-subsidized capital in just 5 years of political summits and task forces.
Right.
By 2030, the volume of processing capacity built outside of China will still be a fraction of what is required to genuinely break the monopoly.
Unless, and here's where it gets really interesting, we look at the Council on Foreign Relations strategy document. Because this is the wild card that flips the entire board.
Yes, the CFR report introduces a paradigm shift. Their fundamental argument is that the US and Europe are currently playing a losing game.
By trying to compete directly.
Exactly, trying to outmine and outprocess China using a rulebook and a timeline that Beijing designed is financially and politically unviable.
So their strategy is to stop trying to replicate the Chinese supply chain and instead leapfrog it entirely through Western innovation.
We changed the recipe. The report details heavily funding the commercialization of rare earth-free magnets for electric vehicles and wind turbines, and it highlights advanced mine tailings recovery, which is really fascinating.
Break down how the tailings recovery works, because honestly, that sounds like alchemy to me.
Essentially, instead of digging a brand new mine, which takes 20 years, you use newly developed chemical leaching techniques to go through the massive, toxic slurry pits left behind by old, abandoned mines.
Oh, the waste left over from decades ago.
Right. You extract the residual critical minerals like cobalt or copper that older technology just couldn't separate. It's faster, it circumvents the initial permitting nightmare, and utilizes domestic sites.
That's brilliant.
The report also heavily emphasizes industrial-scale e-waste recycling.
Okay, I have to push back on the e-waste angle, though. E-waste recycling is notoriously expensive and wildly inefficient right now. We're talking about melting down old electronics to pull, like, a few milligrams of lithium or neodymium out of dead iPhones.
Right.
Are you telling me a lab breakthrough is going to scale up fast enough to replace millions of tons of raw ore needed for the global energy transition?
That is the exact friction point. But the CFR argues that the timeline for innovation is shrinking rapidly. We aren't relying on traditional trial and error laboratory science anymore.
What are we relying on?
AI accelerated material science. AI models are now capable of simulating millions of molecular combinations in a matter of days to discover new, efficient alloys that simply do not require the specific elements China controls.
Wow.
If you engineer an electric vehicle motor that runs optimally without neodymium, the strategic value of that specific rock absolutely plummets.
You bypass the need for the Central Asian mine, you bypass the toxic Chinese refining plant, and you bypass the compromised Georgian port entirely. The lab beats the mine shaft.
Exactly. And that introduces a profound, almost tragic irony for the Central Asian nations.
How so?
They have spent the last decade painstakingly reforming their legal codes, opening their geology to the world, and finally capturing the maximum attention of Western capitals.
Just in time for the West to potentially invent a way to not need them.
Yes. If substitute materials technologies mature at an accelerated rate, the geopolitical premium placed on Central Asia could evaporate almost as quickly as it materialized. The window of opportunity they are currently trying to squeeze through might be closing faster than anyone anticipates.
Man, let's bring this all together for you listening today. The geology of Central Asia is spectacular, and the region is making all the right moves to extract it. But turning raw rocks into a secure, Western-aligned supply chain is a monumental task.
It really is.
It means confronting the reality of how rare earth elements are actually refined, this environmentally brutal process where China holds 90% of the cars and all the metallurgical expertise. It requires cutting through Moyan inflation, all the political theater of billion-dollar promises, to find the kind of patient, 20-year private capital that the West really struggles to mobilize.
And it demands fixing that incredibly fragile geographical bottleneck in the Republic of Georgia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where a single underfunded port currently dictates the flow of the entire Eurasian Middle Corridor.
It is a supply chain defined by its weak links. And the ultimate wildcard from the CFR leaves us with a critical question to consider as this decade unfolds. The geopolitical maneuvering we see today is based entirely on the assumption that we will always need these specific rocks to build the future. But if AI-driven materials science and advanced recycling actually succeed in leapfrogging the need for freshly mined rare earths, what happens to the economies and the stability of Central Asia? Will their moment of maximum strategic leverage end with them holding mountains of suddenly obsolete rocks in a post-mining world?
An entire global chess match rendered completely irrelevant by a breakthrough in a laboratory. It is a staggering possibility to consider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the actual mechanisms behind the promises, and we'll see you next time.